In our society, resources are unevenly distributed. The top 1% of households in the United States have 15 times the wealth of the bottom 50%. Now, inequality is an enormous topic, and not all inequalities are worth discussing or particularly interesting. But in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about one type of inequality that is worth discussing. I'm going to be talking about inequalities between black people and white people in the United States. And in particular, what I'm going to be asking is this: what can and should businesses do to address these inequalities? Now, I'm going to be basing my presentation off of two papers. One of them is called Affirmative Action, Bad Arguments and Some Good Ones by Dan Hausman. And the second is a paper by Elizabeth Anderson called The Future of Racial Integration. So let's begin. Now, let's start with affirmative action. Now, affirmative action is a divisive issue today. In fact, I'm writing this lecture in the days immediately following the November 3rd, 2020 election. Now, during that election, California considered a ballot measure that, if passed, would have made affirmative action legal in California. The ballot measure did not pass. Now, one thing we need to recognize right away is that most of the arguments for and against affirmative action are quite bad arguments. And before we can get to the good argument that Hausman gives, we're going to need to clear away the bad ones. So what follows, I'm going to be referring to PHA, which stands to preferential hiring and admissions instead of affirmative action. And the reason why I'm going to be doing that is that's a little bit more specific and it helps us narrow down what exactly it is that we're talking about. So we're going to be talking about arguments for and against giving preference in hiring and admissions to, in particular, black people in the United States. Now, the most common argument against PHA, or preferential hiring and admissions, goes like this: PHA is racist. Now, why would you think that PHA is racist? Well, here's why. Somebody's race generally has absolutely nothing to do with whether one is qualified for a job. Now, sometimes it does. Like if we're hiring somebody to play Martin Luther King in a movie, we're most likely not going to hire Scarlett Johansson. And there's a good reason. It's that her race does not make her a good candidate for that particular position. But when we're hiring lawyers and violinists rather than actors to play Martin Luther King Jr. in a movie, it is not clear at all how race could be a qualification at all. And just as it's racist to prefer hiring white people for positions for which race is not a qualification, one might think that it's also racist to hire black people over white people for jobs for which race plays no role. In other words, race is no qualification. And we can formulate this argument as follows. So I'm going to be just copying Dan Hausman's formulation. So what he says is, on premise one, it is wrong in hiring or admissions to take into account anything other than the applicant's qualifications. Premise two, PHA takes the applicant's race into account. Premise three, race is almost always not a qualification, and thus, conclusion, PHA is almost always wrong. So this argument is sound, and if you don't believe me, you can express it formally and do a little truth tree or a derivation or a whatever to figure out that it's valid, but it is a valid argument. The question is it sound? And the answer is no, it's not sound. And the reason why it's not sound is that the first premise is false. And again, this first premise, what was it? It said, it is wrong in hiring or admissions to take into account anything other than the applicant's qualifications. So we're going to be criticizing that premise. Now, the reason why that is false is that there are all sorts of cases where you think it's perfectly permissible to take into account things other than an applicant's qualifications when we're thinking about hiring them. So, for example, my favorite brand of bread is made by a company that preferentially hires ex-convicts who otherwise would have trouble finding employment. Being an ex-convict has nothing to do with your ability to bake bread. It is an irrelevant attribute when it comes to qualifications, if what we mean by qualification is simply how good are you at making bread. But there's nothing wrong with that. It seems like nobody would be upset about somebody hiring ex-convicts to work in your bread company. They would think that you're doing something laudable by giving people work who would otherwise have trouble finding work. Similarly, imagine we have a company that preferentially hires veterans. There's all sorts of companies like that. Nobody has a problem with that. So if we hold this attitude towards PHA in these contexts, then we would be inconsistent if we endorsed premise one. so we should reject premise 1. Now, you might think that it's dangerous to reject premise 1, and the reason why is this. Imagine if I start a company and just due to my deep-seated hatred for people of a particular race, I refuse to hire people from that racial group. Surely that conduct would be morally abhorrent. It's not simply objective moral, it's abhorrent. Similarly, if we have a whites-only bathroom or a whites-only drinking fountain, that would be objectionable. And in fact, those things did exist, and thanks to the civil rights movement, they no longer do exist. Right? Those are racist institutions as well. So the question is, how can we criticize those institutions if we give up on premise 1? In other words, how can we criticize discrimination on the basis of race if we think that it's permissible sometimes to discriminate on the basis of race in cases of preferential hiring and admissions? So this is actually an easy question. The systematic degradation, humiliation, and segregation that black people face throughout our nation's history is wrong. If people with blue eyes, red hair, or some other feature like that were subject to such treatment, that would also be wrong. But we're smart and subtle enough to be able to distinguish between discrimination on the basis of race and those kinds of systematic treatment. PHA doesn't, in fact, instantiate a system of degradation, humiliation, and segregation that negatively affects white people. If it did, that would be wrong, right? And so what we can do is we can object to something on the grounds that it involves this systematic treatment of degradation, humiliation, and segregation, rather than simply that it involves discrimination on the basis of race. So we don't actually need to be afraid of rejecting premise 1. So we've just rejected a bad argument against PHA. Before we can get to the good argument, though, we need to discuss a bad argument in favor of PHA. And so we're going to start with the idea that when you harm somebody, you should rectify that harm. So we're going to think about PHA as a means of rectification. So this is known as a compensatory justification of PHA. So, when we harm somebody, it's common to think that what we should do is we should rectify that. And to rectify something is to make the world go back to how it was before the harm was caused. So if I steal your car, it seems absolutely reasonable for the coercive power of the state to be used to make me restore your car to you. So notice, that I'm talking about rectification, I'm not talking about reparations. We'll talk about reparations in just a minute, but it's important for understanding this lecture to understand that there is a difference between rectification and reparations. So we're starting just with rectification. Now, black people have been harmed throughout the United States history, and so you might think that that harm should be rectified, and that PHA is a good way of rectifying that harm. So again, we have an argument for this. So Hausman expresses his argument like this. Those who commit injustices owe their victims damages. That's premise 1. Premise 2, massive injustices have been perpetrated against black people. And then premise 3, or conclusion, thus, those who perpetrated these injustices owe damages to their black victims. Now, the main problem in this argument is that it doesn't actually support PHA. So, rectifying an injustice requires a perpetrator to make their victims whole again. That happened in the case of the car. But in the case of slavery, the victims and the perpetrators are dead. And we don't typically think that it is permissible to say that a child is morally obliged to pay the debts of their parents. And we certainly don't think that a person is morally obligated to pay the debts of someone else simply because they share a racial background. And moreover, it's not clear what it would mean to rectify the harm of slavery. What would it mean to bring back the world to the way that it was before it was in a state when slavery happened? Must we endorse Marcus Garvey's racial separatism and Pan-Africanism? And the answer is no, we don't need to endorse those kinds of things. It's just that we need a different approach to understanding PHA than rectification. So I mentioned reparations earlier. Let's try reparations now. So reparations are paid by a government rather than directly by citizens. And the purpose of reparations are to acknowledge and make up for harms that were authorized by that government. And a great example of reparations is what happened with the Japanese Americans after World War II. So during World War II, the United States government rounded up Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps. That was just a horrible thing to do. And as a matter of reparations, the United States government paid $20,000 to Japanese Americans or their descendants who had been placed in internment camps during World War II. All right, so that's what reparations looks like. But the reparations defense of PHA doesn't work. And the main reason why it doesn't work is that reparations are a cost that is supposed to be paid by a society as a whole to the individuals who have been most harmed by past injustices. And PHA does neither of those things. So first of all, the extremely qualified black applicants to medical schools are not typically the individuals who have been the most badly harmed by our nation's history of racial segregation and injustice. And so for this reason, PHA is just not targeted enough to be a good method of paying reparations. Second, PHA is not a situation where the costs are borne by society at large, which is what happens with reparations. So for PHA, the costs are paid entirely by minority job seekers who now have a lower probability of getting a job. If PHA were a form of reparations, it would be unjust to single out this group in particular to pay what should be a debt paid by society as a whole. Right? Now, one thing I want to flag is that I'm not giving an argument against reparations, and I'm also not giving an argument against PHA. The only thing I'm saying is that PHA is a lousy way of doing reparations. We're going to need a better argument to defend PHA. We're going to look at one in just a minute, and you're also going to need another way of carrying out reparations if you're in favor of reparations. So let's look at Hausman's actual argument for PHA. So his argument is that it equalizes opportunity. So I want you to imagine that there are 2 second grade classes and 2 third grade classes in a school district. Each grade has 1 good teacher and 1 bad teacher. Now let's assume that the students are randomly assigned to second grade teachers. Right? Question is now, how should we assign the students to third grade teachers? One way to do it is to have a lottery. So we could just say that, no matter who you got for second grade, we'll just enter you into a lottery, and then you get a 50-50 chance of getting the good teacher and a 50-50 chance of getting a bad teacher. You could do that, but another option would be to, instead of having a lottery, say that all the students who had a bad teacher in second grade now get a good teacher in third grade. And it's also going to be the case, if you do that, that all the teachers who got a good teacher in second grade now get a bad teacher in third grade. Now, the second option, where we equalize outcomes with respect to how many good teachers you get, is the key to understanding how PHA is actually fair. So when we take the second option, what we're ensuring is that each student has the same opportunity to have a good education. PHA, in this way, ensures equality of opportunity for everybody. And so when businesses are thinking about PHA, they shouldn't think of it simply as a method of rectifying or paying reparations for past injustices. What they should think about is that PHA is necessary for helping bring about equality of opportunity today. Now, discussions of how to address inequalities between black and white people in the workplace often begin and end with a discussion of PHA. And this is a mistake. The reason is that PHA can be decided at the level of corporate policy and human resources, but the much more difficult work happens every day when we work together inside the workplace as we try to build truly integrated communities. So the question is, what does it mean to have an integrated space, and why should we care? Well, let's talk about what it means to have an integrated space first. Now, today, workplaces in the United States are formally desegregated. And what this means is that we no longer have laws and policy that force segregation of public accommodations and facilities and workplaces. And they no longer force the segregation on racial grounds. Now, formal desegregation is something that we can kind of take for granted today. But before we just sort of move on and talk about other forms of desegregation and integration, we need to remember that this did not happen overnight. Formal desegregation was the result of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, and this was a movement that took some of the greatest tactical minds who've ever lived organizing campaigns to fight against segregation and for racial justice. Right? So we owe the activists in the civil rights movement a huge debt of gratitude for bringing about a formal formal integration, so formal desegregation. But formal desegregation is not enough to give us integration. Now, the abolition of laws that enforce segregation is a hollow victory if it doesn't result in spatial integration. So what's spatial integration? Well, spatial integration happens when substantial numbers of people of different racial groups actually occupy the same spaces. So this is to say, a formally desegregated workplace is not actually an integrated space if it ends up being a workplace that employs almost entirely white people. What we need is for the workplace to actually occupy. We need to have a workplace that hires people in such a way that people of different races actually are occupying the same space. So suppose we do that. Suppose we have a spatially integrated workplace and we use PHA to accomplish that. But now what happens is that you have workers of different racial groups occupying different roles, where white workers are predominantly occupying managerial roles and black workers are predominantly occupying custodial roles. The black workers are promoted to managerial positions sometimes, but when that happens, their white subordinates don't give them the same respect that they would give their white managers in the same workplace. Is that workplace integrated? The answer is no, of course not. What we need is something called formal social integration. So formal social integration happens when people work together as equals in the formal roles that exist in the workplace. And this can't happen if members of different racial groups occupy different roles in the workplace, or if commands from managers are treated with varying levels of respect depending on the race of the manager. So suppose we achieve formal integration, right? Formal social integration. So when formal social integration has been achieved, is that enough to achieve real integration? Almost. So imagine that a formally socially integrated workplace exists, but black and white employees occupy different tables in the cafeteria and form different social groups for interacting outside of work. What we're still lacking is something called informal social integration. And once informal social integration has been achieved, we have a truly integrated workplace. Now, so that's what integration is. Why should we care about integration? Why should workplaces try to integrate? Isn't it enough just to have formal social integration? But we need to go all the way to promoting informal social integration. So we're going to talk about 3 reasons to care about integration from Anderson. So the first one is that segregation produces a dignitary harm. Now, it should be clear to everybody why formal segregation leads to a dignitary harm. It's extremely degrading and demeaning to tell somebody that they are not welcome in a public space simply because of their race. And these same dynamics characterize other forms of segregation. So without formal social integration, black employees are still stigmatized as less deserving of respect than the white employees. And while nobody is obligated to become friends with or date somebody in the name of social justice, our socialization preferences are sometimes the result of our inner racially stigmatizing representations of others. And when we exclude somebody from our social group simply because of our hidden racial prejudices, we cause a dignitary harm still. So for this reason, informal social integration is valuable based on dignitary considerations. So there's another reason why we should care about integration, and this has to do with socioeconomic opportunities. So predominantly black neighborhoods often have fewer opportunities for banking, shopping, education, and most forms of employment. And these neighborhoods have less access to public services, higher rates of poverty, and weaker real estate markets. So as a result of these factors, if you're born in such a neighborhood, the structural features of that neighborhood are going to make it difficult for you to leave. And social segregation exacerbates all these problems. So why? Well, people often learn about job opportunities through social networks. And if social groups self-segregate based on race, that creates another barrier to socioeconomic opportunity. And so what we get is a cycle. You're born into a neighborhood with fewer economic and other kinds of opportunities, so you're not able to get a job, you're not able to leave that community, you end up staying in that community. There's less money in the community now to pay for public services and better schools, and that just kind of perpetuates the cycle. So that's the second reason why we should care about integration. A final reason is that segregation undermines our democracy. So in a democracy, citizens of different walks of life interact on terms of equality with each other about matters of public concern. Without the voices of everyone, important perspectives and facts are left out of the deliberations. And because of this, the discussions are less rich. And so for this reason, segregation of any form challenges the realization of the democratic way of life that we all value. So what can businesses do to help with integration? Well, one thing they can do is they can engage in PHA. So hiring people from different racial groups in searches for diverse roles throughout the company results in spatial integration. Now, after you do that, after you try to fight against spatial integration, you need to strongly enforce norms of collaboration and respect once the new employees have arrived. And this can result in formal spatial integration. Finally, you need to have social events. So you can have company softball games or picnics, bar nights, or all sorts of other things that involve employees interacting informally, socially with one another. And that can result in informal social integration. So one thing that's incredibly important to notice is that Anderson's integrationist defense of PHA is very different and in many ways superior to compensatory arguments and also diversity defenses of PHA. So the compensatory defense of PHA goes something like this. It says, PHA is useful for compensating people for past injustices that they have experienced. So the rectification or the reparations defense we talked about earlier and rejected fall into this compensatory kind of model. Now, the problem with the compensatory rationale for PHA is that the people who benefit directly from PHA are not the people who are often in most need of compensation. So someone who manages to exit a poor neighborhood, earn a full scholarship to do an undergraduate degree at Harvard and a JD at Yale Law School is already much better off than someone who, due to the structural factors I surveyed earlier, was not able to leave the neighborhood and pursue their education. Right? And so to give the Ivy League graduate preferential treatment in hiring over a non-minority applicant would not be an effective way of compensating for past injustices because the individuals most in need of compensation aren't targeted. Right? So that's the problem with compensatory justifications or PHA. The integrationist rationale does a lot better. So the integrationist rationale says that PHA is justified on the grounds that PHA can result in fighting for an integrated society by opening up social networks to people of different races and creating an internal company culture in which racial stigmatization is decreased rather than increased. Right? So in other words, we're trying to fight for an integrated society within the company and outside of the company, and PHA can help us do that. Right. So that's one way that the integrationist rationale that Anderson offers is an improvement over the compensatory model that we looked at. Now let's talk about the diversity rationale. So the diversity rationale for PHA says that PHA is justified because it leads to greater diversity. And there's many objections to the diversity rationale. So it leads to a racial spoils system, conflates race with culture, places excessive weight on race in comparison to other metrics of diversity, and unjustifiably uses race as a proxy for diversity when other things like political affiliation are often the more relevant kinds of diversity for particular kinds of questions. So again, the integrationist defense of PHA solves all these problems. And the reason why is that the integrationist seeks racial integration rather than simply diversity as an end. And there can be no more relevant proxy for racial integration than race.